one of my pet hates about Hong Kong is people run STEM programs. We've got a massive global shortage of teachers. I mean, English speaking international education needs to recruit 500,000 more teachers by 2030. I think AI is interesting because I think the changes it's going to bring to society as a whole, and particularly to the professions, preparing young people for a world that is going to be different to the one in which their parents grew up is, I think, one of the challenges that schools have. There is this future and it's very different, and it doesn't have A-levels in. The irony is, to get into Oxbridge or Ivy League, you need to be doing the interesting stuff. What we really want is a bit more risk-taking and a bit more innovation and a bit more thinking.
Hello everyone, today we are speaking with Mr. Mark Steed, the Principal and CEO of Kellett, the British International School in Hong Kong. Mark, thank you so much for talking with Avernus Education.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Kellett is placed in Hong Kong. For listeners that are maybe less familiar with the territory, it's an international school following UK curriculum, and a lot of students do come from the UK or then move back to the UK, possibly for studying at university. What would you say is the real attraction about an international school in Hong Kong over a UK school in the UK?
Well, I think here at Kellett what we're trying to do is to offer effectively the equivalent of a London day school education, but in Hong Kong. I think we're a strong alternative to going back to a boarding school in the UK. Academically, we got the best A-level results of any British international school in the world last year, and we'd sort of rank in, I suppose, the top 30 schools in the UK. Certainly rank higher than nearly all the boarding schools. So, this is a very strong academic education, but we try to sort of carry that British ethos of, the extracurricular, the sport, the music, the drama, the adventure, and all the rest of it alongside.
We sometimes speak with parents, and there's a sense, I think particularly post-COVID, that sometimes it's a little bit claustrophobic in Hong Kong, and students can be a little bit caught up in the moment and maybe not have that wider perspective on life and sort of know what lies beyond Hong Kong and the future.
Well, I think by nature international schools have got a diversity that you don't always get in other schools, certainly the schools that I've been involved in the UK. And I think that diversity is on a level playing field, in a sense that it's not that you've got the home students and the overseas boarders. You've got everyone is at the school. Everyone lives in Hong Kong. There's a sort of an equality there that I think is really important. As a school, one of the big things, I suppose, one of the most popular bits of our curriculum is that we have a global outlook week in October, and pretty much the whole school ship out around Asia, going to different places. That's got an element of service about it. Our younger students, year 6 students, have just come back from a trip to Japan. Historically, they went to Beijing, and I think Beijing will be back on the radar once things open up a little bit more in China. So I think that outward-looking aspect is really a really important part of it, and certainly our graduate students go on to universities all around the world. I mean, we have about 50-60% go back to the UK, but we do send significant numbers to North America, both to the US and to Canada. We have students going to top universities in Australia, and actually increasingly people are looking at some of the other alternative European universities as well. So I think that there is that outward looking aspect is, I think, a very important part of the school.
Yeah, it must be lovely now that things have opened up a little bit more, that all those trips are back on the agenda. And just to talk briefly about, you said 60% of your students look to UK for university, and obviously that's a a huge market. I think last year something in the region of 700,000 international students studied at British universities. About 580,000 of them were from this part of the world, from more Asia, China and Hong Kong. What do you think it is that attracts them to the UK for university?
Well, I mean, UK universities are still some of the finest universities in the world. I mean, America has got a few very good institutions, and they're obviously there are a lot of other top universities around the world, but the sort of Oxbridge, the London universities, Edinburgh, I mean, are really phenomenal institutions. And I think it's that English-speaking education seems to be the one of the key things. I think Britain sort of punches above its weight really academically. It's in global terms it's a relatively small country, but it's obviously got an enormous historic influence, both good and bad. But because of that, it has a very established educational system, and it does produce some of the best research and some of the best teaching in the world. So it's obviously a very attractive place to go and study.
And do you find generally that the transition of your leavers and then the alumni network, they've very much enjoyed that experience? They feel like it was the right choice. Do they have to overcome particular hurdles? Sort of what would you say those were?
Yeah, I think students need to really do their research, and I think one of the challenges that students over the past couple of years have had is they can't go and see universities. We've had a sort of couple of cohorts who haven't been able to go and visit universities. So, I mean, you need to realise that St Andrews is a very remote university, and I think so. There are students who find that very challenging after living in such a vibrant city as Hong Kong. So I think my advice to students is, do go there, don't just apply blind, go and see the universities. It's worth investing the time and in travel to go and see these institutions. You're going to spend 3 or 4 of the most important years of your life there, so I think it is worth spending some time getting it right.
Is there anything particular that you focus on at Kellett through that process, through that sort of journey as students get to that sort of business end of the application, that you feel gives them the tools that they need to make those choices?
Yeah, I mean, we have an established programme, pretty much like they have at most of the UK schools, where this process starts well before the sixth form, and certainly really kicks in up a gear or two in year 12. You need to have all this stuff in place. If you've got aspirations to go to sort of Oxbridge Ivy League, then you need to start working on what that portfolio looks like well before you get into the sixth form. And I think students who have got clarity around what they want to study, I think have an enormous and why have an enormous advantage over those who don't. I mean, it's one of those areas where a student who knows that they want to be a doctor, or wants to be a lawyer, or wants to go and study biochemistry or whatever, is able to then focus their additional sort of time and research and get involved in projects that relate to that application, which will enhance the application. And the earlier you can start that, the better. If you make a late decision to go and read sort of PPE, it's not going to work nearly as well as if you've sort of had a couple of years run at it and got some work experience and certainly done some interesting projects along the way.
Sure, and starting early, that's absolutely a key, isn't it? And I think talking about sort of moving on to maybe some of the subjects and degree choices that are in vogue or not. The Times recently ran a headline, "Losing Humanity by Degree." I am a historian myself. Do you see that this is a trend that we need to be worried about?
Yes, I mean, I always find it one of my pet hates about Hong Kong is people run STEM programs, which was there to fill a gap in America where there was a shortage of STEM related qualifications and trained people. Hong Kong, you don't have to sell people STEM at all. It's sort of in the DNA. I think one of the interesting things is that the subjects that are most human, which are the humanities and English and these sorts of subjects, I think are going to come back to the fore. I think as in a world where technology rushes on, there obviously will be some people who are very, very skilled in it, but the thing about computers is they're very good at maths and physics in a way that that writing poetry isn't quite in the same way, and those humanity aspects I think are going to come back. We've obviously got very strong science here at Kellett. Academic schools tend to lean slightly more towards science, but I think it is really important that there's also some very, very strong arts and humanity education going on as well. I think it will be interesting to see how things develop over the coming years, and I think this wider aspect of being human and what it means to be human, I think will become more important.
It's a really interesting take on that. I think possibly gives confidence in humanity as well. I suppose at the other end of the spectrum, I know that you've done quite a lot of work and certainly advise various groups regarding things like cyber security and AI, both huge issues, I think, for society and culture in the modern day, but also how that then intersects and interplays with education. As a school leader, does this come into the sort of day-to-day aspect of the school? And really, I suppose maybe taking AI to start off with, I know that Anthony Selden sort of announced that committee, that working party, with a view to needing to be on the front foot of AI in education. Do you see it as a threat?
No, I mean, Kellett hosted a conference as part of a global series last week actually on AI, and so it is an area that I'm particularly interested in. I think we've got to be careful how we use it in education. I mean, I think it's really blown up, obviously, with all these sort of ChatGPT sort of models where students are able to cheat in a new way, sort of cut corners, have their essays written for them. I think that this is, for me, it's not a worry. It's another tool. We've coped with these things, in the history of education. People said the same things when I was at school when calculators and programmable calculators came in, and we had to ditch our slide rules. So I think the whole thing, education evolves, and I think we've seen this one coming, and some of us have been involved in what this might look like over the past few years. I think AI is interesting because I think the changes it's going to bring to society as a whole, and particularly to the professions. In reality, most students who come through top international schools, top UK boarding schools, whatever, are going to go into some sort of professional class of work, and AI threatens that in a way that automation threatened manual work. Has threatened manual work over the past sort of 10 decades, I suppose, past century or so. So AI is going to be interesting, and I think preparing young people for a world that is going to be different to the one in which their parents grew up is, I think, one of the challenges that schools have. And I think to do that, you've got to understand how it all works. I spent a lot of time 3 or 4 years ago learning how machine learning operated. I'm particularly interested in the ethics of AI and how we use them and how we make ethical decisions, or how we capture ethical decisions in a world of machine learning. I think that becomes quite difficult, and I think the way in which teaching young people to be critical of how AI works in terms of understanding the importance of unbiased data sets and all the rest of it is all very important. So I think education needs to shift, and I think this is when one of the tensions we get, particularly here in Hong Kong, is that there's all this new stuff happening, whether it's AI or cybersecurity or everything. But there is a very conservative, traditional view in Hong Kong that is meat and two veg only. You know, you've got to do your 3 A levels, you've got to get your 3 A stars. And I think, I think Hong Kong's got this fundamentally wrong. I think it isn't just about getting 3 A stars. It's about 3 A stars plus doing something incredibly interesting or being able to engage with some of these really important debates. So I think that's the interesting landscape here in Hong Kong. Is how I speak to a lot of parents who just want the results. They just want to do this, and actually what they need. And the irony is, to get into Oxbridge or Ivy League, you need to be doing the interesting stuff, because every applicant has got 3A stars. So what's the differentiator? Well, it isn't your 3A stars. So I think that's the debate. And I think what worked for parents is not going to work for their children.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's a challenge certainly that we see from our side as well, is how can we empower students to understand what else they need to do to stand out amongst that cohort with straight A's. And maybe leading on from that, do you think that the current model of examinations is the best fit for preparing global citizens and young leaders of the future when so many of them do come out with such excellent grades?
I really don't know. I definitely think there's a world, and a lot of the discussions that are happening in education, even at a very high level, are saying that there is this future and it's very different and it doesn't have A levels in. I think the problem, I think everybody sees that as a better place where we can all get to, where we assess students differently, that we develop students. We don't teach to the test. I mean, the danger now with the way that exam rubrics have gone and the way in which sort of schools try and game the system, it's everything. Everything is formulaic. So when I was at school, you could write a maverick essay and get an A. I hadn't got A stars in then. Today, you have to follow the formula. So everything's become very formulaic. It's therefore become very dull in order to get the top grades. So, and I think that everyone realises that that's wrong. So we need to get to a different place. But the question is, how do you get there? How do you bridge from where we are to where I think nearly everyone in education wants to be? How do you get across? And I think and governments don't want to be. No government wants to be the person who got rid of A levels. So they are stuck. I think educationalists are frightened that other people will jump on the bandwagon. I think what's interesting is that that increasingly, the top universities are realising that the real thinker, you don't have to be particularly bright to get top grades. You just have to crank the handle. So I think they are looking at the wider stuff increasingly, and I think this is where parents haven't picked up that actually that it is this wider portfolio of experiences that are more important to getting into a very top institution, rather than just getting the grades. The grades is yes, I can the grades are the sort of skills you need to be a very good, reliable accountant. And that isn't necessarily what people want in terms of creativity and innovation at the university level. So I think that's what that shift will happen. How it will happen, I don't know. I think one of the surprising things is we've just had 2 years when we actually got all the right people, roughly, pretty much the right people, got into all the right universities without sitting A levels. So I think that's quite interesting that we're now sliding back. And then you throw in ChatGPT and say, well, we've got to assess them in the classroom now because they're only going to cheat outside. And the conservatives who are really good at cranking the handle and do very boring education are definitely, going to sort of say everything's got to be assessed within an exam hall. I think that's bad for education, because I think what we really want is a bit more risk taking and a bit more innovation and a bit more thinking. So we balance that. The old Kellett, we have to balance the old system of cranking the handle and getting them through, but also trying to prepare them, this sort of side curriculum that prepares them for the world that they're going to have to live in and give them the skills that they really need.
Absolutely, and that must be driven by some very dedicated and passionate teachers that are very skilled at what they're doing. And sort of leads me on to a question. I know you recently had a letter published in the Times, just alluding to some of the difficulties and possibly prejudices that colleagues that have taught in a school like Kellett, not specifically Kellett, but just working abroad, when they try to return to the UK, they may be coming across some obstacles. And I have to say, I agreed completely with sort of comments that you made in that particular letter. Is this a new thing? I suppose, do you think, will that stop great teachers coming out here and dipping their toe into the fantastic opportunities that teaching at Kellett could provide? Is something that you're maybe worried about from that side of things?
So, I think there's a wider context here. We've got a massive global shortage of teachers. English-speaking international education needs to recruit 500,000 more teachers by 2030. That is a staggering number of teachers. Now, there's an element in which people will come out from the UK. There's an element of which schools will grow their own. I think schools like Kellett and the top schools in Hong Kong will not ever struggle. We have some of the highest salaries of any school in the world. Even when you take the cost of living into consideration, the staff here are very well remunerated. So I don't think there will be a problem in terms of that aspect, but I think there is a global problem. So there is going to be a sort of scrap for talent to attract the very best school teachers, not only to Hong Kong and to Kellett, but to any school around the world. So that's going to be a real challenge. And obviously, there is a massive problem in the UK in terms of teacher recruitment, retention, and the pipeline is sort of drying up. I think in the letter to the Times, I was simply saying that there are a lot of people who work abroad whose hearts are back in where they came from, their home country, whether that's Australia or whether it's South Africa or whether it's UK, and at some point they want to go back, but what I find is when colleagues want to go back, they find it really difficult to get jobs, and that is slightly ridiculous given the quality of the teaching and learning that goes on in schools like this. I previously worked in Dubai, which was probably the most inspected regime in the world. You've effectively got an annual Ofsted in Dubai, and so you've got people who have got great skills. They've worked with diverse communities. They've probably dealt with EFL in most international schools to some extent. They've got so much to offer going back into the UK, and yet they face prejudice. They're told they've got to go to an interview, for example, face to face, which is and they're not going to pay travelling expenses from Hong Kong. Well, that's a very big ask. I've known people do it, but it's a very big ask. We've got people, the prejudice against the fact they don't value the sort of schools that work internationally. And, the irony here is, of course, that, I think the British international schools probably are some of the very best schools in the world now. even better than the UK independent schools, because we're not tied up with the sort of the distractions that are happening in the UK in terms of education. I mean, the whole debate about whether there's going to be VAT on school fees and so on, it's just sapping, management time. Whereas, I can sit down and say, well, look, we're inspected by BSO, so we're accredited, but we don't have annual inspection. We haven't got the Education Bureau from in Hong Kong on our backs. We can be innovative. We can teach what we want. We don't have to slavishly follow the English national curriculum. If we don't want to teach spinning jennies, we don't have to teach spinning jennies. We can decide we want to teach something that might be a bit more interesting, like the principles of coding or design thinking or something. So I think some of the most innovative and sort of dynamic education is going on in international schools. So it's a real shame that these teachers can't go back or are finding it difficult to go back.
Well, I don't think too many of our listeners will necessarily feel aggrieved at the lack of focus on the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of our listeners are parents, but possibly there might be some students listening that aren't able to access the kind of education that Kellett provides. Just to end, Mark, what would be your sort of 3 nuggets, 3 pieces of advice to sort of an ambitious young learner, possibly listening to this from a completely different context, different part of the world, just broadly how they can make the most of their time at school?
Yeah, I think the first one would be, don't be afraid to make mistakes, but learn from them when you make them. And I think that that's really important. That the aim isn't to get it right first time and every time. It's about getting it right when it matters, which is when you're in the exam hall. So I think take some risks. Do learn and get involved. Follow your passions would be my second bit of advice. Find the thing that you really love learning, and do more of it. Work with. I don't know a teacher who wouldn't give extension work and reading or point people to things to do. Our very best students here, are doing university MOOCs in the subjects they're interested in. They're supplementing their learning. They're going beyond, and that can start as early as possible. And my third one is, don't forget to read. I think what I find slightly surprising is that people are digesting and learning in a different way. Young people do watch a lot of YouTube and take in media digitally, but I think that there's still an enormous learning experience from reading books and bringing that information in. And realistically, that's what you're going to have to do in life. You're going to be still reading text and having to do stuff with it. That's what adult life in the workplace looks like. So developing those skills, and also universities, you're going to get some books to read. You go up to Cambridge to read a subject, and that does involve reading. So I think that so getting into some books, having some books under your belt, I think are really important. I think one of the best things that my Oxbridge teacher gave me was a reading list, and I'm still working my way through it. It's sort of 40 years on, but I love the books on there. They were great. It was a great reading list to try and work my way through, and I think that's it. That, I suppose, if there's a fourth one, which is don't stop learning. But that's not advice for young learners. Keep going.
Mark Steed, Principal and CEO of Kellett, the British International School in Hong Kong. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
It's been a great pleasure. Nice to see you.